This opening move, 1, d4, immediately stakes a claim in the center of the board and opens lines for the queen and a bishop, aiming for central control and rapid development. This move, nf6, initiates a common and flexible response to 1, d4, often leading to openings like the Indian defenses, where black aims for rapid piece development and a strong central presence without immediately committing pawn structures. This move establishes central control and prepares to develop the queenside pieces, often leading to a queen's gambit declined or related positional struggles. This move signals an intention to enter a queen's Indian defense or Nimzo Indian defense setup, preparing to control the center with pawn breaks and develop pieces harmoniously. This move develops a piece, controls central squares, and prepares for further development, commonly leading to the queen's gambit declined or Catalan structures. This move initiates the queen's Indian defense, aiming to control the center from the flank with the fianchettoed bishop and create an active queenside pawn structure. This move, bf4, develops a piece actively and prepares to control key central squares, often seen in Queen's Indian or Bogo Indian structures. The move b-flat7 develops the bishop to an active diagonal, preparing to control the long light-squared diagonal and potentially support a queenside pawn. Advance with c5 or a6. This move solidifies the pawn center and prepares to develop the bishop on d3, aiming to control key central squares and support a potential kingside attack or central pawn push. Developing the bishop to e7 follows standard Queen's Indian defense principles, preparing to castle and reinforcing the kingside defense while maintaining flexibility for future pawn advances. This move develops another minor piece, prepares for castling, and reinforces the central pawn on d4, following standard opening principles. The move nh5 is a thematic maneuver in this Queen's Indian defense setup, aiming to exchange the light-squared bishop, a key piece for white's control of the dark squares, or to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially f4. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, supporting the central pawn advance and preparing to challenge black's fianchettoed bishop on the long diagonal. This move solidifies the pawn structure and prepares to develop the queen's bishop to a more active diagonal after moving the knight. This move neatly repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, anticipating the development of black's queenside pawns and preparing for kingside castling. This move, nd7, prepares to reinforce the d6 pawn and potentially facilitate the advance of the c pawn, while also offering flexibility for the knight's future placement, possibly to f8 or even e5. Castling kingside is a standard developing move in this Queen's Indian setup, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks for future action. This move prepares to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and support a future kingside pawn advance. This prophylactic pawn move prevents black's knight from potentially harassing white's bishop on g3 via nh5 and also creates a safe haven for the king on h2 if necessary. This knight exchange simplifies the position and avoids creating a backward pawn on h6. But it also relinquishes the knight's valuable defensive presence on the kingside. This pawn recapture opens the f-file for your rook and reinforces the pawn chain, creating a more solid central structure while preparing for potential kingside action. With the kingside now slightly weakened by the pawn exchange, castling is a prudent move to safeguard the king and connect the rooks for future action. The rook moves to the c-file, aiming to control the open file and support the advance of the c-pawn, potentially leading to central pawn breaks or pressure on black's queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the important light squares and support potential pawn advances in the center. This move prepares to reinforce the c-file and potentially shift the rook to a more active square, like c3 or even d2, to support the d-pawn and central play. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to influence the center and potentially support a kingside attack or prepare for queenside play depending on white's development. This move repositions the rook to the f-file, preparing to double rooks on that file or to support a pawn push on the kingside, while also connecting the rooks. The move k7 is a sensible repositioning, bringing the queen to a more active square where it supports the central pawn structure and prepares to potentially eye the kingside after castling. This move is prophylactic, tucking the king away from the open c-file and potential future attacks from black's bishop on g7 and other pieces. This move prepares to contest the c-file and possibly expand on the queenside with the b5 pawn push, challenging white's central control and piece coordination. This move centralizes the queen and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside or support for a kingside attack, while also connecting the rooks. This move strategically centralizes the rook, preparing to contest the e-file should it open, and supports a potential pawn advance with e5. This move prepares to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting a kingside pawn advance or reinforcing control over the long light squared diagonal after the central pawn's shift. This move strategically prepares to reinforce the d6 pawn and potentially expand on the queenside with a future b5 push, solidifying black's central control. This move aims to prevent black's b5 pawn break, which would challenge white's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's pieces. This move initiates a pawn break in the center and kingside, aiming to create space for the black pieces and potentially challenge white's pawn structure. This move boldly initiates a central pawn break, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and challenge black's solid pawn structure before black can consolidate their queenside expansion. This pawn break fundamentally challenges white's central control and opens lines for black's pieces, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and create dynamic counterplay on the queenside. This pawn exchange on f5 opens the f-file for white's rook and initiates a dynamic confrontation in the center, challenging black's pawn chain and potentially leading to an attack on the kingside. This pawn recapture opens the e-file for your rook and challenges white's central pawn majority, preparing to activate your pieces in the center. By exchanging queens, white simplifies the position and enters an endgame where the doubled pawns on the f-file, a result of the capture 11, fxg3, become a potential long-term weakness for black. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, bringing the rook to the open e-file where it can exert pressure on black's weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially support an eventual advance of white's central pawns. This move opens the d-file for white's rooks and creates an immediate tactical tension, potentially forcing black to commit their pieces and revealing their defensive setup. This pawn capture on c5 opens the b-file for black's rook and allows the queen to become more active on the queenside, while also creating a passed pawn for white on the d-file. This rook move prepares to contest the open d-file, aiming to gain activity and potentially support a pawn push on the queenside or center. Black captures the knight on c3, disrupting white's pawn structure and opening the b-file for potential counterplay against white's queenside. White recaptures on c3, establishing a connected pawn majority on the queenside while opening the b-file for potential rook activity and solidifying the central pawn structure after the exchange. The rook on f6 aims to redeploy to a more active file or support a kingside advance, while also defending the pawn on f5. This move prepares to double rooks on the d-file, aiming to exploit the open lines created after the exchange of pieces and increase pressure on black's central pawns. This move challenges white's rooks on the open files and aims to disrupt white's central control, potentially preparing to activate black's rook and create threats against white's kingside. This knight maneuver aims to redeploy the knight from the compromised g1 square to a more active central post, potentially eyeing f3 or d3 to support the kingside or central play. This move unblocks the king and prepares to reposition it to a more active square, likely to support the central pawn majority or defend key squares. White boldly sacrifices a pawn to open the d-file and create attacking chances against black's exposed king and undeveloped queenside. This capture is forced, allowing white to maintain a material advantage and exploit the weakened kingside pawns. This capture on d6 aims to simplify the position by exchanging pieces and taking advantage of black's misplaced king, potentially leading to material gains or a stronger pawn structure for white. The king now centralizes, escaping its vulnerable corner position and preparing to join the battle in the likely simplified endgame by heading towards the remaining central pawns. This rook move is designed to reposition the rook to a more active file and potentially support an advance on the kingside, while also preparing to defend against black's central pawn majority. Black's king is now exposed in the center, and white's rooks are poised to exploit the open file and potentially attack the king on the e-file. The rook now retreats to a more secure square on the second rank, aiming to support the pawn on a3 and potentially prepare for further central pawn play. The move intends to activate the rook from the passive square on the first rank, aiming to control the open c-file and potentially support an advance on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest control of the d-file and potentially support advances on the kingside. Black captures the knight to eliminate white's strong central defender, accepting a doubled pawn on the f-file in exchange for simplifying and potentially weakening white's kingside. This move reclaims the pawn lost earlier and centralizes the rook, preparing to contest the now open c-file and exert pressure on black's king. This move, Knight5, aims to challenge white's central pawn structure and activate the knight into a more aggressive central square, potentially attacking white's pieces and pawn on c3. This move aims to centralize the rook on an open file, aiming to exploit black's slightly loose king position and potentially create threats along the third rank. This move repositions the king to a more active central square, preparing for potential pawn advances and supporting the knight on e5 while seeking greater influence in the endgame. The bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weak pawns on the kingside and potentially supporting a further advance of the central pawns. This pawn move prepares to challenge white's bishop on a2 and aims to create counterplay on the queenside by opening a diagonal for the queen or rook. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the a4-e8 diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses on black's queenside while supporting the pawn majority. This capture on c4 seizes a pawn advantage, opening lines for the knight and threatening further material gain with the bishop on a4 now powerfully positioned on the long diagonal. The rook's advance to e8 is a strong positional move, aiming to exploit the semi-open e-file and pressure black's weakened pawn structure after the exchange of pieces. This pawn recapture on c3 opens the c-file for white's rook and allows black's knight to gain more central influence, creating complex tactical possibilities. The rook aggressively occupies the 7th rank, forcing the black knight to defend the pawn and limiting its mobility. This move is a tactical blunder, as the knight on e3 is immediately attacked by the rook and can be captured, leading to a material loss for black. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the weakened pawn chain on black's queenside and supporting a potential advance of white's rook. Black's move aims to solidify the queenside pawn majority and potentially create a passed pawn, but it weakens the d4 square and allows white to exert pressure on the kingside. The king repositions to the safety of the corner, preparing to support the g-pawn and potentially retreat further if the opponent's pieces press on the kingside. This move attempts to bring the rook into a more active position along the now open c-file, but it allows white's king to escape the pawn threat. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square, attacking the advanced black pawn and potentially supporting a further advance of the white pawns. On the queenside, the capture on c3 offers white a decisive material advantage, consolidating control over the crucial c-file and forcing black's king into a precarious defensive position. This move challenges black's advanced passed pawn on c3 by introducing a piece that can directly contest its advance and potentially support white's own pawns on the queenside. This pawn advance aims to gain space on the kingside and potentially create a passed pawn, but it weakens the king's position and may allow black to exploit the open kingside diagonal to the king. This move is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by opening lines for the g-pawn, but it weakens the kingside further and allows black to advance their passed c-pawn. This move aims to prevent white from consolidating their king's safety and potentially creating threats along the newly opened g-file, while also offering a pawn sacrifice to gain time for counterplay.